Our speaker for this evening is Shoshana Goldberg, and she uses she, her pronouns. Um, she's a research associate at Strength in Numbers Consulting Group. And there she oversees research and evaluation for social justice clients, largely in the field of LGBTQ youth health, as well as HIV/AIDS. So she holds a faculty appointment at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Is that correct, Shoshana? Yes?
Yeah, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at University of Illinois, Chicago.
Fantastic. And
all over the place.
And there she teaches graduate level courses on LGBTQ health. She has over a dozen years experience in public health research, and she holds both a master's and a PhD in maternal and child health and epidemiology from the Gillings schools of global public health. She has training from the UNC Carolina Population Center and the Fenway Summer Institute for LGBTQ Population Health. Now, one of the things that I absolutely need to read, because this is so dense in terms of content, but we need to hear this. We've never had a speaker with quite this specific background. The areas of expertise that Shoshana holds include domestic and international, social, structural, and policy political determinants of LGBTQ health, adolescent health, health disparities, and sexual and reproductive health. Now, it's a mouthful, but like really all of these areas are areas that we've touched on either in other conversations, and really you seem to house them all under one roof, one brain, Shoshana. So we're so honored to have you. Before joining Strength in Numbers, and actually where I found Shoshana was in some of the consulting for research institute and think tanks that she's participated in. Specifically, she published a report for the Center for American Progress, and it specifically spoke of the impact of transgender sports policies on health and well-being for transgender youth. And when I solicited Shoshana via email, a cold call, so to speak, via email to say, hey, would you be interested in having a conversation with us? Immediately, what struck me was her matter-of-factness, the fact-based science, very empirical approach, and the caring and the love for the community that's also so obvious. So she really brings both together, not only in her writing, but in her speaking. And so Shoshana, please take it away. We're just so thrilled that you're here to speak specifically of, the rise of transgender sports bans and what, where they stem from and what we can do to converse about them and move things forward for our community.
Hi, well, thank you so much for that really amazing introduction. Yeah, I guess it is kind of a mouthful. I'm used to providing my research interests in very much this academic context where there are certain buzzwords you have to say, but then hearing it read out loud, I guess that's a lot of words. But basically that all means to say that I look at policy and social determinants of LGBT and adolescent health. So in addition to working at the Center for American Progress, I also spent the last 3 years at the Williams Institute at UCLA, where I did a lot of their demography and policy focused work. So I would work with survey data to estimate how many LGBT adults or youth in a country, in a state, in a city would be impacted by specific policies. So I did a lot of work around the Equality Act, estimating the size of the LGBT population, looking at the impact of various policies. So estimating how many, adults would gain housing protections if the Equality Act were to pass, things like that. But my foray into public health really came from adolescent health and LGBT health in particular. I actually live in North Carolina now. I've been here for the last 11 years, and I know firsthand what it can look like when you have these anti-trans bills passed. So HB2, or our bathroom bill that happened in 2016, was, I think, a bit of a bellwether for what we're seeing right now in terms of a bill that was passed by a state that was not from the state or of the state, but rather driven by sort of this larger movement and push, often led by conservative groups, to look at trans kids as sort of this wedge issue, both as a way to rally the base and as a way to kind of create an issue that doesn't exist, while also distracting from those issues that do. So, you know, HB2, all things we talked about were the bathroom restrictions, but it also had, you know, provisions that prevented localities from raising the minimum wage, it weakened worker protections by preventing workers from, you know, filing certain types of non-discrimination lawsuits. And the bathroom bill was kind of the easy component to it that was, they thought would get people to support the bill, because they would think, oh, I don't want to man the locker room with my daughter, and they wouldn't read the rest of it. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, a lot of these policies are not going to be enacted. Even just a few hours ago, North Dakota's governor vetoed a attempted sports ban in that state. We also know that we have a federal administration that is pretty explicit that Title IX does extend to gender identity protection. So if these laws, as they continue to be allowed to be enacted, will almost certainly be faced with lawsuits. The first state to pass a trans sports ban was Idaho. They passed it last year, and it was almost immediately enjoined following a lawsuit from a trans athlete there, Lindy Hillcox. So I don't know that anyone expects these to ever actually happen, nor do I think that anyone who is passing these bills believes that there is a threat. But while the supposed risk is fake, the impact of these bills will be real and will have impacts far beyond just whether or not trans kids can play sports. We know that simply just the rhetoric that surrounds these bills can be incredibly harmful. The aspect, I mean, you are all parents of LGBT youth, many of trans youth, some of you yourselves are trans, I myself am queer, and I know that watching your state debate your right to exist and your right to belong, and the spaces in which you can exist and the ways in which you can identify is incredibly damaging and incredibly harmful. And particularly when we think about why we like sports to begin with, like the whole benefit of sports is, particularly for kids, is an opportunity to, you know, participate and be part of something bigger and a group and learn leadership and discipline and come into your own. All of these things that happen during adolescence, and sports is one of the ways that can happen. And by denying access to sports based on really no evidence and no backing except for, you know, hate, as far as I can tell, can send a very stigmatizing and damaging message to our youth. I think one of the big things that we often say in public health is that when we talk about disparities, it's not race, it's racism. It's not trans identity, it's transphobia that leads to the health disparities that we see. So the reasons why trans youth and LGBT youth in general have higher rates of suicidality, depression, anxiety, etc., is not because of anything inherently wrong or worse or weaker or mentally deficient, but rather it's about the society that they live in and the social cues and cultural cues that they get from the people around them. And so when we talk about things like social determinants, what we're really saying is what are the messages that exist? What are the laws that exist or the policies that exist? And what are the messages that those laws and policies send? And that can be everything from, a school's dress code to like a state sports policy to a federal non-discrimination protection. And these all send the message that trans youth are or are not welcome. And right now we're seeing more often than not, they are sending the message that they are not welcome. So to give you a brief overview, in 2021 alone, 30 different states have introduced bills to ban trans kids from playing sports. 5 states have enacted those bans, including Idaho, who, as I said, is currently enjoined. In addition, we have seen some federal efforts which have failed. So if you don't remember, with the COVID Protection Act or the COVID Relief Act that passed last month, it was held up for about 12 hours almost when Senator Tuberville in Alabama attempted to attach an amendment that would ban trans sports or trans people from participating in sports and withhold federal funding to schools to allow trans kids to participate in accordance with their gender identity as opposed to their biological sex. That was defeated, which is great, but it was close. And we're seeing more and more states pass this, and at the same time, less common, but is starting to come up, is also this push for bills that are banning medical care as well to trans youth. So banning providers from giving care to any youth under the age of 18, or in the state of North Carolina where I live, anyone under the age of 21, potentially criminalizing or threatening the license of providers who do offer care. And so this is the starting point, unfortunately, not the ending point. And yeah, I think that some of the things that I can kind of talk about are, what these bills say, what are some of the myths that are inherent in them, what are some of the ways we can fight them. But really the thing that I want to, I can give you a lecture, but it sounds like a lot of what you've all been talking about is wanting to really have the right tools and the right messaging to be able to answer the critiques that you're hearing, or answer or respond to some of the myths that you're hearing perpetuated. So I think, what I would really prefer is if like anyone could tell me like, what are some of the things that you've been struggling with how to articulate or wanting to have help on knowing how to discuss, and we can kind of take it from there. Unless anyone has any opposition or wants like a quick 30-second primer.
Oh, fantastic,
Maybe.
Shoshana. I think that that's really helpful you've laid really a great foundation for us. And if you have any specific questions, please drop them in the chat so that I can share them with Shoshana. But even to get us started, what's really at the heart of this debate is are all youth sports affected, or is it really more based on, is there a gender component to it specifically with regard to female youth sports?
So that's actually a really good question, because I think one of the things is also, I didn't talk about that enough earlier, but is a very important component of it is the misogyny and like the gender component of a lot of these bills. So they are by and large not about banning trans kids from sports, but they are about specifically banning transgender women from women's sports. Often these bills have names like Protect Women's Sports or Fairness in Women's Sports, and utilize languages and frames of social justice and feminism, safety, protection, fairness, and opportunity as a way to kind of get people on board with them. And in reality, they are anything but. I know, we all know trans women are women. So by banning trans women from women's sports, we are banning women from winning women's sports. We're not protecting cis women, we are banning trans women. And these are based on the assumption that there is a inherent biological advantage that biological males have, or males assigned at birth have, and therefore, if you allow trans women or any like assigned male at birth person to play on a women's sports team, they will have an advantage. They will destroy women's sports as we know it. They'll win all the medals, win all the races. Women will never get scholarships or medals again, and everything will be ruined. And so if you let them happen, you have this happen, you must hate women's sports. So there's a lot of things, to kind of talk about with that. Yeah. So first of all, this has not happened. So while these laws are relatively new, many states have in fact had trans, including your state of California, have had trans inclusive sports policies at their high school athletic or their state athletic association level for years. In fact, the earliest one was in 2008 in Washington. And we have never seen this happen. From multiple states to the NCAA to several like professional and in amateur sports leagues allow trans people, both trans women and trans men, to play alongside people of their gender identities, both their biological sex. And this has not occurred. There are a lot of people that point to what happened in Connecticut with 3 cis women athletes who ran track who lost in certain heats to trans women runners. That was at the heart of a suit that was filed in Connecticut against the Department of Education, and claiming there was a Title IX discrimination claim, or Title IX discrimination against the runners. 2 of those runners eventually went on to beat the trans athletes they competed against in subsequent matches. And that's kind of it. In Washington, the first state that allowed trans athletes to compete, I think it's 4 have competed ever. So we're not seeing this rush of people pretending to be trans to play, and we're not seeing that when trans people do play, they're beating cis people. A lot of this language just sort of denies the physiological capacity of women to excel at sports. They talk about a prototypical woman and a prototypical man, ignoring the fact that there's massive biological and physiological range within people of the same gender. You think about what's his name, Alex Holland or whatever his name is, the free solo dude who has an entirely different brain, which allows him to not process fear. And so he can climb higher and faster and longer than other people because he doesn't have the same fear response. Or Michael Phelps, who has this crazy large wingspan, also anaerobic differences within him that allow him to swim faster and hold his breath for longer than other athletes. So there already is a wide range, and it's not happening, and it hasn't happened. So that first myth that we have to protect women this is not the way to do it. And in fact, when you ask women and women sports experts what the things are that are the biggest threat to women's sports, it's not trans athletes, it's lack of funding and lack of opportunities and the high cost of playing sports to begin with, which can exclude a lot of people regardless of their gender identity. And when there is any sort of budget cut when it comes to sports, it tends to be the women's sports that are cut before the men's sports because there's just less of an attention on women's sports. So these are the things that women say threaten their sports. All of these fears just don't exist. And in fact, in Alabama, Senator Duberville's state, the one who tried to attach it to the COVID bill, which would have, by the way, provided money for families who are struggling and potentially could offset the cost of sports and help them or offset the cost for schools and school districts that could help them recoup budget losses to continue to fund women's sports. Alabama ranked 49th out of 50th in terms of unequal gender opportunities for women's sports versus men's sports. So the threats that women's sports are facing have nothing to do with the 40% of the 1.5% of youth who are trans who want to play sports. Sorry, I don't know. Yeah. Oh, yes, and I also agree with what Tyler was saying about like toxicomania, that there's this whole other issue around like people who are intersex and the way that this also like criminalizes trans bodies, and it's often been used to push back against women's bodies, particularly women's bodies of color. Like we cannot ignore a lot of the racialized and gendered language that goes into these bills, and the sort of one, I think it capitalizes on the idea of like women, mostly what they're talking about when they talk about women, they're talking about like white women who are in distress and under threat, and we have to band together to save the poor innocent girls who need help with their sports. And they set out restrictions for how a person can be defined based on their gender. So it should be your sex on your birth certificate, or in the cases where they say like it's in question, sometimes they will require medical or physiological exams. If kids are on hormones, they may have to go for repeated medical checks beyond what's recommended by the American Pediatric Association, American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, and sort of say like these are the types of bodies and these are the types of hormone levels that make you a woman or make you a man, which ends up really hurting, you know, people who are gender, people like, you know, as Tyler was mentioning with toxicomania, who is a cis woman who has a difference in sex disorder, higher testosterone levels, and because a legislature has decided that this is how we define bodies and gender, as opposed to a person and their family and their doctor, people are being excluded. And yeah, so.
Yeah, because currently there are policies specifically at the Olympic level and with the NCAA with regard to female participants in particular to have a specific sustained hormone level for a period of a year. But beyond that, there's no specific regulation or any data to support the bills.
There's no data to support the bills. And I think that actually kind of is a good dovetail to Jeff's question about who is behind the bills. So one of the main groups is the Alliance Defending Freedom. They are a conservative alt-right group that has been behind a lot of anti-LGBT legislation, anti-choice legislation. So if you look at the actual text of a lot of these sports bills, they're identical or very, very close to identical, and use whole swaths of language exactly the same. So they are a right-wing hate group that funds a lot of state efforts to, the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF. There's a series of, I can put in the chat, a few really good articles about them.
Thank you. And if you prefer to do that at the end or closer to the end, that's okay too. Or if you whichever works for you, Shoshana. As far as putting it in, dropping it in the chat right now.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I had it handy on a slide elsewhere. So they have been funding a lot of the lawsuits. They were the ones who brought the suit up in Connecticut, and have been helping to. No one is willing to say on the record who helped these states write these bills, and who was the person who wrote it with the legislature who introduced it, but it's pretty clear that it's from ADF. There's also another group called Save Women's Sports, which is, the Women's Sports Working Group is another ad hoc coalition of women's advocates who are claiming to be in pursuit of saving women's sports by excluding trans women from sports. Um,
Shoshana, what would you say in terms of for youth sports specifically? I was reading in some of the articles where clearly there's the sports even like before high school or for prepubescent children, there's the idea of hormone levels, and any of that even is incorrect or shows no significance in terms of performance or muscle mass or anything like that, because youth sports isn't really about that anyway. But in terms of just overall performance, the literature shows that there's nothing really there's no leg to stand on in that perspective either. Is that correct? Is that what you found in your research?
yeah, I mean, I think that like, particularly for like youth, so like the thing is, okay, with sports, with youth sports, the vast majority of youth athletes are not going to go anywhere. It's fun, it's good for them, they enjoy it. There's not any like standout athlete, and you know, this stuff doesn't matter because like these are not like professional or future professional athletes. For those who are the most elite level and are going somewhere with their sports and are like have the potential to, you know, get a scholarship, go pro, etc. Their gender identity and their hormone level is not necessarily the thing that's driving it. It's, you know, their physiological capacity, and then like we're not seeing like the, you know, biological disadvantage that women have as elite female athletes are like elite enough that they're going to continue medaling, as we're seeing the fact that they continue to medal when they play alongside trans sports. So yeah, I mean, I think that what I would say is to a lot of the kind of pushback against hormones, I think that what happens is it sounds reasonable, right? Boys are stronger than girls. If you let a bio male into your team, then they will beat all the bio girls. That sounds like an ostensibly reasonable statement. But the reality is, if that was going to happen, it would have happened. And it has not happened, because nor has it happened in any of the sports where trans people have been openly playing for decades, from the Olympics and the NCAA all the way down to like middle school sports. It's just not happening. And I think that when we talk about this, it's based on the assumption that these are totally new things that are happening, ignoring the fact that like there already are trans athletes competing. And, you know, some states have, you know, there's different high school athletic associations by state have different restrictions. You know, California has no surgical or medical requirements. Other states will have medical requirements. You have to be on hormones for a certain length of time, or you have to have like you have to go through a form process where you like register a gender change or a gender different from your birth certificate, where you get like, you know, kind of like a similar, although slightly less intensive process is what you would have to do to have like a gender marker changed. So initially change your gender marker at school is to like for the purpose of playing on a sports team. But yeah, I would say that like I understand why people would say that, but it's just not happening. And it doesn't seem to matter. And you're saying that you are assuming that you know better than all the NCAA coaches in the IOC and the state coaches that are letting kids on their team and are believing that they are doing the right thing and have not had this impact. So I don't know. I think that one of the reasons why these bills go so far is because a lot of people just aren't paying attention. And so one of the things that's really insidious about them is that they use this language of protection. They use this language of feminism to sound reasonable to people who are not necessarily like explicitly or even like implicitly transphobic. They just haven't thought about it, and they hear, oh yeah, I want to say women's sports, like sounds great, sign me up. But when you actually talk to people about it and you poll people on it, the majority of people are against these bills. You know, like there was a poll that just came out through HRC where 73% of people polled either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that trans people should be allowed to participate in sports in a way that's safe and comfortable for them. And when you like actually break down the bill, I mean, I think this is the thing that we've seen in many issues, that the alt-right is much better at messaging than unfortunately we are, and weaponizing language against us.
Yeah. And can you speak a little bit about the benefits of trans athletes, really how they benefit from the gender inclusive policies, or for them to have the opportunity to compete on the team that they play sports and compete on the team that they identify as? You spoke a little bit, but.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch of different benefits. So first of all, trans students benefit from playing sports the same way that cis students benefit from playing sports, because they're playing sports. You know, they're working out, they're on a team, they're getting new friends, they're having additional role models and mentors through their coaches, and learning discipline and competition and all of the cool things about sports that we love for sports for our cis kids, like, are there for our trans kids. They want to play sports for the same reason that cis kids do. They love sports the same way that cis kids do. There's no real difference in that. You know, for the report that I did for CAP, I talked to 5 different trans athletes, trans or non-binary athletes who played at the collegiate level and beyond. And my sister was like a 3-sport athlete, and the way that she talks about sports and the way that they talk about sports is exactly the same. So, you know, you get to benefit from being on sports. So just in and of itself, it's the same. But there's a lot of additional benefits that trans kids get. So the first one is, much like we know that a lot of trans anxiety, depression, and suicidality can be linked to lack of acceptance and discrimination, harassment, and violence. We also know that when trans youth are exposed to supportive mentors and are accepted, their risk of suicidality and depression and anxiety goes down. So by having a coach who accepts them and a team that accepts them as they are and for who they are, that sends a message: you are valid and you are welcome and you belong as you are, all parts of who you are, as an athlete and as a trans person and as a student. And that's a really powerful message to send, particularly when every single day you open up the newspaper and there's another state passing another trans sports ban. And it's kind of this insidious message that you're getting often, that is that you are anything but welcome. So in public health and academia, we often talk a lot about this theory called minority stress. And so you'll oftentimes hear like aspects of it. So like, if you've heard of things like microaggressions is sort of a component of it. But the idea is that LGBT people, and in this case, trans youth, are exposed to all of the general stressors that everyone else can be exposed to. You know, poverty, family, divorce, homelessness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they also are exposed to additional stressors, which are explicitly linked to their trans identity. And it is this constant, repeated exposure to transphobic messages and transphobic experiences, be they hearing things on the news about who you are and are not allowed to be, or being kicked off a team, not allowed on a team within a experience, that continues to perpetuate the message of transphobia, which can eventually be internalized and absorbed and sort of lead to higher risk of depression, anxiety, suicide. So when we push back against that and we're like, no, this is not who we are, this is not what we stand for, you are welcome, you are here, you are valid, you are loved, that's really, really powerful. Things are not deterministic. People can be resilient to anything that's thrown at them, but the biggest thing that we can do, and it's so great to hear that some of you are like principals and teachers yourselves or parents of trans students or trans athletes yourselves, is that the more people who affirm trans youth identities and the more who say like, no, you are who you are, I see who you are, I believe you, and you are welcome as you are, the more likely it is that they will be able to develop the resiliencies to counteract a lot of the harmful messages that they're getting. So I think particularly in a time like this, where it seems like there are so many people out to, and it's like almost like powerful and insidious, the efforts that are being made to push back against trans sports participation, to go against the grain and let them participate, it's gonna be a particularly powerful message.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I'm just going to check if there's any questions in the chat, and please, everyone who's on the call, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. There are no questions that are too small or that are silly or that everyone already knows. If you have a question, please ask it.
Yeah, and I would also say, like, we've seen that, like, for example, like there's in the National College Health Association, they do an annual survey every year of college students, and among trans college students, those who were playing sports had lower rates of suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, higher rates of campus connectedness, and feeling included in campus, and feeling accepted. So we already are seeing among trans athletes like lower rates of suicidality. We also know that just the existence of a bill or the lack thereof can have a really strong message. So among youth, suicidality was lowest among trans youth in states that do not have a ban, and was highest among states who have a discriminatory ban. And these are not among trans athletes, these are just among trans youth in general. So just the existence of living in a state that has a trans sports ban can be harmful.
Yeah, even beyond those who are wanting to participate in sports, it goes beyond that, because it
well, but I mean, you also have to, exactly, so it goes beyond that. And even more than that, it's like it sets up a situation where, one of the reasons why trans participation is lower is because like trans kids are afraid sometimes to try to play, because of what their impact would be, or they would not be allowed to. And so you have this thing where kids may be forced to choose between a sport, and like you may start playing a sport at 3 and not want or decide to transition until 12, and suddenly you have to choose between a sport you've been playing for 9 years or like being who you are. And then there's just trans kids who don't want to play, but they just hear that. And then they know, okay, well, like, I don't want to play sports, but like, that's still, that gym teacher still is would not let me play sports. So why would they be okay with me coming to gym class? Like, why would this school district want me to transition at all if they're not going to let me play sports? So it sends a message that like, not only you're not welcome in sports, but like you're not, because so much of these bills are about saying that you can only play based on what we decide is how a person is a woman, or in some cases, a boy or a man. And if that's not you, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm seeing 2 different questions. We're seeing within so Catherine asked, have you ever seen within accepting communities that as a trans athlete, you are welcome to compete, but you better not win? It's either a false sense of protection or some other motive. I haven't seen that. In fact, what we're seeing more and more is a lot of cis women athletes coming out in support of trans athletes. So for example, there was an open letter signed by hundreds of NCAA women's athletes across the country in support of, the NCAA's trans inclusive policy and pushing back against the trans sports bans that are happening. And it was powerful enough that the NCAA put out a statement saying that they are vehemently opposed to these trans sports bills that are happening right now, and will actually refuse to hold any championship games in states that have a trans sports ban. And we saw that happen in North Carolina when HB2 passed. We lost the March Madness tournament. And look, I'm at UNC, my husband's at Duke. Like, basketball is a religion here, and we lost basketball. We lost the All-Star tournament as well. So like the NCAA is like not screwing around. And we saw like there's a whole coalition, like, Megan Rapinoe had a whole op-ed, and she has an entire sort of like coalition of advocates who are all women's sports, and as well as male athletes as well, who are kind of coming together to say like, no, we want trans athletes here, like we want them to be part of it. So I think that in general, when trans kids or trans athletes play, their teammates are supportive and want them to play and win. They don't want them to like hold back.
Michelle,
okay.
Yeah, Michelle has a question on what we can do to help prevent these bills from passing.
Yeah. I think it's the same sort of strategy that we employ with a lot of bills. You put the pressure on. You keep putting the pressure on. So we are seeing left and right many governors vetoing these bills solely because of the public outcry and the public pressure that is happening. So like speaking out when you can, calling your legislator, calling your governor, if you are in a position of power, putting out a statement to say that like this is against who we are, publishing op-eds. Like I think that the NCAA was actually a really powerful thing. That's one of the NCAA and the NBA pulling out of North Carolina was a really big thing that helped to get the bathroom component overturned, as well as the U.S. starting to sue us because we are in violation of Title IX. So, and like starting to withhold federal funds to North Carolina because of HB2 being in violation of Title IX. So, I think it's a lot of stuff like that, not being quiet, and using the machines you have to really say like, to really like capitalize that and continue to spread the message and continue to put the pressure on, because I think that's what is working. And then, at the same time, like, Republicans are going to Republican. Like we saw this happen in Arkansas, where there was the state ban on providing medical care or gender affirming care to youth under the age of 18. Passed the House, passed the Senate, the governor vetoed it, they overrode it because that's what they were going to do. And the governor vetoed it because, and this is what he said, because of the public pressure that he received and the outcry that he received, but the legislators still overrode it. And so when that happens, like the best thing that we can do is to like continue to support our youth and say like, we are not going to abide by this, or like make statements against them, and like to support our own trans youth and our kids and say like, this is not who we are. I promise you this is not who we are. I stand with you. You can protest, you can sort of like continue to make the message, because like our kids are listening and they'll see it if you push back against it, and that can be enough sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really helpful perspective. There's a question from Tyler specifically with regard to where the non-binary athletes fit in the puzzle. The question of kids play sports based on their gender is in and of itself binary. And so for a non-binary athlete, do you have any perspective to share on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that we have not quite figured out. One of the people that I interviewed for my report is a non-binary athlete. So they are a swimmer. So they swam in college. They were assigned female at birth, swam on the women's swimming team, now is a coach. Was actually on part of the NCAA committee on LGBTQ inclusion. And I was talking with them about it, and they kind of did the same thing where they were like, okay, for me, I want to stay on the women's team, and I want the women's team to still be called the women's team. So, I made sure that when my name was announced over the loudspeaker that they used my name and my pronouns, not my dead name. And that was a decision in the playbills. But that was really like what works for them on a one-on-one basis. And I don't know if we figured out what that looks like for non-binary athletes. The ideal situation would be that they could compete on the gender that they identify as or that they feel most closely with. But I think what that looks like would be different, because there's also another person who I interviewed who identifies as non-binary, was assigned female at birth and wanted to play on the male team, and so transitioned and then started playing on the male team, even though they identify as non-binary. They do not identify as male or as a woman. And so for them, playing on the men's sports team was the team that worked the best for them. And in both of these situations, it was in conversation with their coaches and with their college athletic directors, and this is a situation that they decided and worked for them. But yeah, I think that one, we don't have specific policies for it yet, but it would ideally be, like I said, the same way for other trans youth who are like trans feminine or trans masculine, which is that they would play in accordance with gender identity that they prefer.
Thank you. There's a question from Jeff specifically with regard to to your point of Megan Rapinoe and the op-eds and
oh yeah,
that have come out and really been outspoken about support of trans women or trans athletes. But this one pertains to there have been some prominent lesbian athletes who've come out against trans women competing against cisgender women, like Martina. I'm thinking, this is a tennis one, Jeff? I'm thinking it's Martina. Would it be Martina Navratilova, or I'm not sure. Yes, okay, so it's Martina Navratilova, who would have been outspoken specifically about trans women competing at tennis against cisgender women.
Yeah, that is true. That is happening. There is unfortunately this has historically been a thing that has happened within this sort of like fractionalizing of like the lesbian community and like the whole, often you'll hear the term TERF, or trans inclusionary radical feminists. And that often is sort of attributed to particularly queer women, lesbian women. And that has sort of, at the root of that is one, this fear that like trans women are co-opting a female experience that is not theirs to co-opt, and that is subtracting from like the stigmatized experience that lesbians have as women. And yes, I mean, you are right that is happening. And but Megan Rapinoe is also a prominent lesbian athlete who has come out explicitly in favor of trans women playing sports. Transphobia and trans affirming attitudes are not restricted to one political party, gender identity, or sexual identity. I am sad. I was sad to see that, and that has been frustrating because there's also been several like LGBT athletes advocates that have kind of come out with a bit more of these trans exclusionary statements. But I think, like, as a cis queer woman, like, I feel that, like, one, the trans women are women. So, like, my experience as a woman and their experience as a woman, although they are different, like, I am still in solidarity with them as a woman, and I'm in solidarity with them as like a queer person, and they are a trans person. And I am of the attitude that like there's both enough equality and enough, you know, oppression to go around. We don't really need to play the oppression Olympics, and that I think to assume that this will just stop with trans youth and that this won't also kind of underlie things that will eventually come for queer women is kind of ignorant. Like, I think we see that, you know, like a lot of religious exemption laws both get at anti-choice legislation, or rather they have anti-choice implications as well as they have anti-LGBTQ implications. And, you know, these laws, which will have things like, oh, if your gender identity is in question, you'll have to undergo like additional medical examination or prove that you are really a woman, is probably going to be used against, you know, any non-conforming person, any non-conforming woman or woman of color. Like, I think it was Tyler who had mentioned like Pastor Semenya earlier. So this will probably come for them as well. So it's a sad thing to see, and I hope that it goes away.
Yeah, well, with someone who has a woman with POCS or polycystic ovarian syndrome or things like that, that really cause hormonal disruption in the body, and that can really, you know, create something that's completely different from a hormonal level and could prevent them from participating when really they there's a question here. I'm embarrassed to admit that as the parent of a trans kid that I'm still confused about how to respond to people who have an argument that trans women could have an advantage over cisgender women in sports. It's a tough one for me to answer. I know that men's bodies are often stronger and faster than women's, and I'm fully supportive of trans women, 1000%. However, I just don't know how to answer this question when it comes up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I totally get that. You know, I've talked about this a little bit, but like if you want some like numbers to give, currently 42% of all high school students in the US live in states that have a fully inclusive trans policy. An additional 23% of the additional quarter have participation allowed with some restrictions, such on like medical transitions, so having to have been on hormones or not been on hormones, or been on hormones for a certain length of time, depending on the state. And this has been happening for years without any actual issue. In fact, so California, your state, which has had a trans inclusive policy since 2008, sports participation is up. It's the highest it's been now, even with the pandemic in 2020, and it's increased every year for women, even whereas among men, it's stayed somewhat stable. In Connecticut, another state with the trans inclusive policy, and that was at the heart of the lawsuit that I was talking about earlier, sports participation has increased among girls, and it's also increased specifically among female track athletes or among female runners. So we're not actually seeing women being driven out of sports, or, you know, or a drop in sports participation to begin with when these inclusive policies are passed. In fact, when it happens, you're just seeing that like more women are participating in sports. So, and they're not losing any less. There hasn't been a single trans athlete who has gotten a scholarship through the NCAA. So they're not taking any athletic scholarships. Trans people have been allowed to participate at the Olympics for about a decade. There has not been a single trans athlete who has played. There is one trans American athlete who qualified for the trials. It was a trans man, and he dropped out. He didn't even finish the trials. So yes, ostensibly, sure, maybe if you found like an average man and an average woman, that man would be faster or stronger than that average woman. But like, among actual athletes, it is not happening. And so that's what I would say. I would say, I get why you think about that, but when we talk about athletes, we talk about high school athletes, it either doesn't matter because they're high school athletes and they're kind of shitty at it, or they are elite enough that it also doesn't matter because they're so extraordinary that they're going to be extraordinary. And at the same time, this fear has not come to pass.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. And I also think that to continue, would you say, Shoshana, that to continue also to really help people understand what being trans or how a transition occurs, it's not something that is on a whim, that is just a flavor of the day that someone would do to win at a sport, to go through that. It's two separate things, and to continue to educate people on what it is to be transgender, or to transition, and all the repercussions and the experience of those individuals is not something that you would just decide to win at a sport. Because I think that has come up as a concern as well. There's going to be a huge influx of people deciding that that's what they're going to, which is a misunderstanding, complete misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. Exactly. First of all, okay, even if you are in a state like California, which is just sort of like this is your gender identity, and so somebody's going to walk in and be like, I'm a girl, blah, now you just let me play. For you to be able to actually play at the NCAA or the Olympics or any sort of professional league, you still have to prove like specific hormonal, or it's usually hormone requirements on surgery. So it's going to be based on like testosterone levels or estrogen levels and length of time that you've been on hormone blockers or gender affirming care. So there's a ton of restrictions once you get to the elite level that no one's going to do that. No one is going to spend the time and the energy and the money and the stress and the logistics of going to different doctors and getting the care and like filling out all the forms and stuff just to like play a sport.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really see, if that's what you were going to do, I would have spent that time in the gym instead of trying to pretend to transition to get to play. So yeah, I mean, I think that's like an offensive thing to say. And I think that like one of the things, I'm not saying that you are offensive, but I think that also when people say that further delegitimizes trans identities among those who actually are trans. It says that like, oh, you don't actually know who you are because, you know, how could anyone possibly be trans? Like they're all just faking it, which is a really shitty message to send and a stigmatizing message to send to all trans youth or to any youth to begin with. It suggests that like we as adults think that you as youth do not actually know your identity. And what you say you are is not who you are, and you don't actually know better. Like we know better than you do. And so that can be really harmful for trans youth, or gender nonconforming youth, or any kid who identifies as anything non-normative, if they could risk being told that they would not be accepted in that identity, that their identity is not who they think they are.
Exactly. Thank you for putting that so beautifully and respectfully as well, because that was exactly my point. So thank you for being able to articulate that so well, Shoshana.
Thank you.
As far as there's a comment that came through, and then we'll wrap it up. The end of the day, of all the kids who play youth sports, less than 2% of them go on to play NCAA Division I sports or elite sports. So if you're trans, you still have to be in the 2% of elite level athletes to have a chance to have a real competitive advantage. That was
Yeah.
Tyler.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's not happening. I don't know. Every time that we say this, it risks both ignoring or dismissing the youth who identify as trans and sending stigmatizing messages to all trans youth, while also like sending some pretty crappy messages to women that like, oh, you'll never actually be good enough at sport because there'll always will be a man that can beat you, as opposed to like having faith that like, no, a woman athlete is like an elite, awesome athlete who can kick ass and will kick ass.
Yes. Thank you. Just to wrap it up, Shoshana, in terms of how would you, what are some of the key things for the parents and for everyone who's here, myself included, and what are the top 3 things as advocates that we can really do to keep this conversation alive, but also to continue to just move this forward for our trans athletes and make sure that they are included and that these policies are not in the way.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first and most important thing that you can do is support the trans kids in your life, be they athletes or not. So if your kid tells you that they're trans, believe them. Don't worry about if they're going to change their mind later or what do they know. Right now, when they are telling you that they are trans, and do what they follow their lead. They may want surgery, they may want hormone blockers, they may want nothing, they may want to use gendered pronouns or neutral pronouns, they may want to change their name, they may not want to change their name. That's up to your kid, and that's up to you all to decide, but like listen to them and follow their lead, because they know what they are saying, they know what they are doing, they know who they are. And if you have a trans kid who wants to play sports, then like research what the policy is at your school. California is an affirming policy, but I think individual schools can sort of may have like more or less paperwork. And I think there's a few people here who had mentioned that their kids, that they have trans kids who are playing sports, so they can probably speak to you about what that process looks like, and what they may or may not have had to do to allow their kid to be able to play. But figure out what the policy is and help them navigate it. Talk to other parents of trans kids about what they had to do to go through it, because like you are an adult and they are a kid, and as an adult you probably have like a much better understanding of the legalese and paperwork and stuff that might have to be done to make this happen. So really like being their advocate, from making sure that the school allows them to do it, to doing all the paperwork and logistical, like crossing the T's, dotting the I's that need to get done to make that happen. So that's for you and your kids. Then there's for other kids. I'm not going to tell anybody how to speak out or how to protest. That's really up to everybody on their own personal comfort level and safety level about how public they want to be, for themselves, for their kid, in their community. There's many reasons why like it may not work for you and your family to speak out publicly, and that is totally fine. But if there are ways that you feel comfortable and empowered to do so, do it. It can be going to a march, it could be writing a letter, sending an email. Most equality state organizations have programs that you can tap into. I know that like the ACLU has a bunch of like national advocates that are kind of like sending out email blasts each week or each day when there's a different state that's about to pass a bill. And so you can kind of like follow them on email or call or text, the people who they tell you to email or call or text. If you are in a position of power, I know there's a few of you who are teachers or principals, putting out statements, it can be really powerful. I know that at UNC when HB2 passed. Sorry, there's a very large bug right above my computer screen right now. Okay. Okay, sorry. So when HB2 passed, the public health school did not do anything. And the business school put out a statement, and the public health school lost several incoming graduate students because they did not feel safe coming to a public school in a state that did not have trans protections, whereas the business school did not, because the business school had made a statement that was in opposition to HB2 and was very in favor of very explicitly saying that trans students would be welcome there and trans staff would be welcome there. So putting those statements out, and in California, where you have an affirming policy, you can also say that you are really glad that this is what your policy is, and that you are so glad to be able to support the trans and gender nonconforming youth in your schools. So both emphasizing things you're doing that are great, that you're happy to be able to do that. So that everyone in the community knows like this is a welcoming place, and that if they want to transition, they will be welcome to do so at that school. Sorry, it's a really large bug.
Okay, I want to make sure that you're safe. So we can, that was kind of the wrap up. Thank you so much, Shoshana, for being with us this evening.